Today, we dedicate the entire Friday program to some of the most important work that City Club does: the objective research, analysis, recommendation, and debate of important issues which will be on the general election ballot. Today, we turn our attention to 3 statewide measures: Ballot Measure 3, term limitations for federal and statewide office; Ballot Measure 7, split roll tax; and Ballot Measure 9, which would declare homosexuality abnormal and perverse. For Ballot Measures 3 and 7, we have both majority and minority recommendations. I'd like to start by introducing the head table. With us today on my far right is Jim Zarin, attorney with Stoll, Reeves, Boley, Jones, and Gray, second vice president of the club and vice chair of the research board. Next to him, Greg Macpherson, also an attorney with Stoll, Reeves, Boley, Jones, and Gray, and chair of Ballot Measure 3 committee. Seated next to Greg is the person who will keep us on track today as our parliamentarian, Randall Kester. Randall is a past president of City Club and also a partner with Cosgrave, Vergeer, and Kester. To my left is Renee Rothage, attorney with Garvey, Schubert, and Baer, presenting the minority report on Ballot Measure 3. Next to her is Alan Brickley, state counsel for Chicago Title Company, chair of the Measure 7 Study Committee, and spokesperson for the minority. John Stride, attorney with Tonkin Torp, Galen, Marmaduke, and Booth, spokesperson for the majority on Ballot Measure 7. And next to John, Alan Oliver, chair of the Ballot Measure 9 Committee. Please join me in thanking these people for their very hard work on these measures. After each report is presented, City Club members are entitled to speak in favor and against the measure or to have questions about the reports. Please limit your comments to 1 minute so that as many members as possible can speak. And our timekeeper today is Jolene Clausen, member of our program committee, seated down here in front. In considering both measures 3 and 7, we will first debate whether to substitute the minority report for the majority report. Debate on the Measure 9 report will be to adopt the club's unanimous recommendation. Before we begin the presentations of the report, I'd like to turn the podium over to Jim Zarin, who will provide an overview of the ballot measures and the ballot measure study process. Jim?
Thank you, Patty. Research on pending civic, public, and political issues has always been a major activity of the City Club. It's been one of the paramount ways in which the club has had an impact on this community over the years. When our study committees work well, they do careful research and conduct thorough interviews to determine the relevant facts. They objectively evaluate these facts in relation to the issues, and they prepare clear, concise research reports with conclusions supported by the facts and recommendations based on the conclusions. In the case of ballot measure studies, this process is brought to bear on a type of study charge that is very clear and very specific. Each committee is asked to recommend a yes or no vote on the ballot measure it studies. And so it is this general election season of 1992 that 6 City Club study committees on ballot measures have gone through the study process to end up with their yes or no recommendations. Last summer, the Research Board recommended and the Board of Governors approved the appointment of these 6 ballot measure committees to address a total of 7 measures on the ballot in the Portland metropolitan area this general election. 5 state initiative members and 2 metropolitan measures. Patty mentioned the 3 today, Measure 9 regarding term limits, Number 7 regarding the split roll tax, Number 9 regarding the OCA initiative, but also Measures 5 and 6 regarding the closing of the Trojan power plant. Measures 5 and 6 were studied by 1 study committee. The 2 metropolitan ballot measures are the Green Spaces bond proposal and the Metro Charter proposal, and those matters will be taken up in the next couple weeks. I want to note that, as is standard practice, 1 member of the Research Board has been assigned as a research advisor to each of these 3 study committees that you'll hear presentations from today. Helen Goodwin served as the research advisor for Measure 3 regarding term limits. Ted Falk worked with Measure 7's committee regarding the split roll tax, and Michelle McKenna advised the Measure 9 committee. The study committee members whose recommendations you will consider today are all members of the club who have volunteered their time in this effort, and they are carefully screened for conflict of interest. This year we are particularly pleased that a number of new members of the club volunteered for and served on these ballot measure study committees. On behalf of the Research Board, I want to thank the committee members for the really incredible amount of time and effort that they've contributed over the past 3 months. There's not a lot of time to become familiar with the issues, arrange and conduct the interviews, and do the drafting and redrafting that's necessary. Many of these people have literally met mornings, noons, evenings, and weekends over and over, and we owe them our gratitude. I also want to acknowledge the critical contribution of our staff, and especially Club Research Director Nancy Kirkinen, in making sure that the reports got to the press on time so that they could reach you today. In the end, the influence of the City Club's research program depends on the enthusiasm, energy, and commitment of everyone involved in the study process. That includes the committee members, especially their chairs, the members, the research advisors, as I mentioned, members of the Research Board and the Board of Governors, but also all of you who have read and studied the reports and will participate in the debates and votes today. And so with your votes today, the City Club of Portland will adopt official positions on State Initiative Members 3, 7, and 9. The club's positions on these members, along with the supporting analyses and conclusions set out in the reports, will become a permanent resource and reference on these important issues for our community. Thank you all for participating.
Thanks, Jim. Jim mentioned Nancy Kirkinen and all of her efforts in this process, and I would just ask her to stand so that we can give her a round of applause. Okay, we'll first consider the report on Ballot Measure 3, Term Limitations for Statewide and Federal Office. Greg Macpherson, Chair of the committee, will present the majority report, which recommends a no vote on the measure. Following Greg will be Renee Rothage, who will present the minority report. Greg?
Thanks, Patty. One of the greatest pleasures of involvement with the City Club is the contact one has with bright, energetic, and civic-minded people, and the committee that I had working on Ballot Measure 3 is no exception. I would like to have the remaining members of the committee who are here today to stand so you can acknowledge their contribution. Rick Braithwaite, Cindy Carroll, Mike Prozan, and Megan Steele. And I also ask that Helen Goodwin, our research advisor, stand as well. Let's show appreciation for their hard work. In addition, one other club member, Michael Lavelle, served on the committee but was unable to be here today. Ballot Measure 3 is the product of a national movement to limit the terms of elected officials. This movement has been fueled by a widespread feeling in the electorate that government is not dealing effectively with major national problems. Term limits have been common for executive positions. For example, the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution imposed a 2-term limit on the U.S. President. And similarly, there are limits in the Oregon Constitution already that restrict the term of office for the governor, the Secretary of State, and the treasurer to 8 years out of any 12-year period. The major significance of this current movement is that it would impose term limits on legislative service, where by and large there have not been such limits in the past. The new term limit movement has made its headway primarily or exclusively really in initiative states, that is, states that have the initiative process for putting measures on the ballot. Ballot Measure 3 was placed on the ballot by initiative petition, and there are 14 other states that are expected to be voting on some version of term limits this year as well, placed there by initiative petition. Ballot Measure 3 would amend the Oregon Constitution to impose limits on the number of years a person may serve in 3 categories of office. Service in the Oregon legislature would be limited to 6 years in the House, 8 years in the Senate, and 12 years overall. Service in non-judicial statewide elected offices would be limited to 8 years. In addition to the governor, secretary of state, and treasurer, which are already limited to 8 consecutive years, this would limit the service of the attorney general, the superintendent of public instruction, and the commissioner of labor and industries. Those last 3 offices are not currently subject to any limitation on the length of service. The third category of office subject to Measure 3 would be representation of Oregon in Congress. A person would be limited to 6 years in the House and 12 years in the Senate. Measure 3 is not retroactive. That is, it does not count the time of sitting incumbents in the past toward its limits. So as a result, it would not have an impact on any current incumbent until at least 6 years after enactment, which is the shortest of the limits it imposes. Our study committee interviewed a number of witnesses, including state and federal elected officials, a legislative staff member, and a political scholar. We also reviewed the national literature on term limits that's been generated by this trend in the body politic. Based on this work, the majority of the committee has recommended a no vote on ballot measure 3. This majority recommendation was based on a concern that term limits are likely to make elected officials less effective because they would have shorter experience. Lobbyists and government staff are likely to become more powerful because they control the information on which public decisions are made. We regard this power shift as undesirable because such persons are not elected and therefore are not as responsive to the will of the people. The majority did find problems in the electoral process where incumbents have a decided advantage over challengers in name familiarity and campaign contributions. However, using term limits to cure these ills is like performing surgery with a blunt instrument. Incumbents will continue to have all the advantages they have enjoyed in the past until the limit is reached. At that point, any incumbent is forced out, whether good, bad, or indifferent. The impact of Measure 3 would be different as applied to state or to congressional offices. At the state level, the majority found frequent turnover in offices, indicating there is no significant problem to be solved. Over the past 22 years, the new members in each session of the Oregon legislature have averaged 27%. That is, 27% of the members in each session were not there the session before. Furthermore, the governor, secretary of state, and treasurer are already limited to 8 consecutive years in office, so there's frequent turnover in those offices. As to Congress, re-election rates in recent years have been very high. However, the majority regards Measure 3 as a poor way to cure that problem because it would apply only to the Oregon congressional delegation. The state would find itself at a disadvantage compared to other states because positions of power in Congress are achieved largely through seniority. We did not find credible evidence that congressional term limits will be imposed by any means other than the initiative process, which is available only in 23 states. At most, term limits would apply to a little less than half of the Senate and about a third of the House, and it's a different proportion because generally the states that have the initiative process are smaller states, that is, have lower population. There's also a definite possibility that state-imposed limits on the length of congressional service will be struck down as a violation of the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, the majority regards Measure 3 as an attempt to solve a problem that Oregon state government does not have. Even if there is a problem to be solved by term limits for Congress, enacting limits for the Oregon delegation is at best ineffective and at worst an impairment of Oregon's influence on issues affecting its interests. Accordingly, I move adoption of the majority report. I'll now turn the podium over to Renee Rothage to present the minority report.
Thank you, Greg. My name is Renee Rothage. I'm the minority chair, and the minority recommends a yes vote to Measure 3. The minority does not believe that term limitations are merely a blunt instrument, but that term limits are badly needed medicine to cure ailments that have cropped up in the political system during the last 50 years. The minority report establishes that term limits are necessary. The most compelling reasons for term limits highlighted in the report are the incumbency advantage and political careerism on the federal and state levels. Turning first to the incumbency advantage, and perhaps the most compelling reason, term limitations are intended to create a level playing field to address the declining electoral competition. Facts and figures presented to our committee demonstrated that, at least on the federal level, incumbents are rarely defeated. The reason incumbents have this advantage is name recognition, access to free television and radio airtime, franking privileges, taxpayer-funded staffs, and the most important is huge amounts of support from PACs and special interests. Granted, under term limitations, incumbents during their terms would have this incumbency and edge and advantage, but they wouldn't have it term after term after term after term as they do now. Term limits will increase competition They will enable more people to be involved in the legislative process. They will provide more opportunities for minorities, for women, and ultimately bring new energy and ideas to the legislative process. We should not be afraid, as the majority suggests, that we are going to lose invaluable expertise, and this is an argument that was outlined quite carefully in their report. The committee heard testimony that it doesn't take years to learn how to operate in the political process, and that often junior members of the legislature, for example, have been quite effective. It does not take years to learn public service. What it takes years to do is become a career politician. And I will use that to transition into the next point that the majority would like to make, and that is that term limits are intended to curb this rise of careerism in the state and the federal level. And one may ask, well, what is wrong with a career politician? And as my time is limited, I'm not going to go into the entire minority analysis, but focus on probably the most troubling problem. And that is that the career politician's main priority is doing, or not doing, whatever it takes to get reelected. And usually that means not rocking the boat, tackling the difficult or troubling issues. It usually means aligning oneself with powerful special interests who can provide badly needed funds in reelection efforts. Term limitations will change this situation by, among other things, shifting the priorities. The main priority will not be reelection, but instead on the voters' concerns and this nation's troubling problems. The minority also concludes and sets out in its report the following conclusions: that term limits will not shift the power to unelected officials. The minority concludes that the term limits will probably be constitutional, and it will not truncate the voter's choice. And finally, the state will not lose this valuable influence in Congress. And I'd like to conclude by addressing that argument, because it seems to be the one that's gaining the momentum in these last few days before the vote. There's two responses. The first is that you can't lose what you don't have. And if we're going to talk about influence in Congress, I would just like to read from the report a fact that our committee learned. That is that Oregon is ranked 50th in the United States in the percentage of tax dollars returned to the state by the federal government. And there has been, I've discussed this with those who say, well, you have to look at defense dollars and Medicaid dollars and slice it up. No matter how you slice it, we still come up 50th. Finally, I would like to just, the second response to the influence argument is that we did hear credible testimony that the seniority system is waning in Congress. As that system wanes, what has been replaced, according to this witness, is a system of merit, where chairmanships are appointed based on merit. The minority believes that trend will continue, and therefore Oregon will not lose valuable influence in Congress. Finally, in conclusion, we should not think of term limitations as merely a blunt instrument, but we should think of it as an insurance policy for our future, for our children's future and their children's future. And therefore, I would move that the minority report be substituted for the majority report.
Thanks, Renee and Greg. We'll now move to debate on the motion. There are 2 microphones that are set up in the audience for City Club members who want to debate the motion to substitute the minority report for the majority report. The microphone to my left and your right is labeled yes. The microphone to my right and your left is labeled no. Please use the yes microphone to speak in favor of the substitution of the minority report, and use the microphone labeled no to speak against the substitution. A yes vote to substitute the minority report means you favor a yes vote on the ballot measure. Please limit your comments to no more than 1 minute, and our timekeeper will ring the bell when your time is up. I'll first recognize someone who favors substitution of the minority report for the majority report, and then I'll alternate between the 2 microphones. We want City Club members only, and please identify yourself at the microphone. I think we have someone approaching the microphone here.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. I am against substituting the minority report for the majority report. The presenter of the minority report started out with a lot of problems that exist on the federal level. We can't correct those by taking action in Oregon all by ourselves. And the problem of incumbency, as established by the speaker for the majority report, is not that serious here in Oregon. I hate to see us lose valued and valuable members of the legislature and members of other parts of government for the sake of not keeping established politicians. Some established politicians do a good job, and I think we should be able to keep them. And for those that don't, that's what we have elections for.
Thank you, BJ. Do we have any other debates or questions for the committee? All right, the motion before the membership is whether to substitute the minority report for the majority report. A vote for the motion means you favor a yes vote on the ballot measure. All those in favor of the motion to substitute, please raise your voting cards. All those against? Okay, thank you. The motion fails, and the motion having failed, we now return to the main motion, which is to adopt the majority report. Is there any further debate before we vote on the main motion? All those in favor? All those against? Motion carries. Thank you. We'll next consider the report on ballot measure 7, the split roll tax measure. Alan Brickley, chair of the committee, will present an overview of the committee report, and he'll be followed by John Stride, who will present the majority report, and Alan will then return to present the minority report and move to substitute the minority report for the majority.
Thank you. I would like to, first of all, echo the sentiments of the previous chairman and express my gratitude and respect to all of the members of the Ballot Measure 7 committee, and also ask them to be recognized. You'll meet John Stride in a moment, but other members that are here, Richard Forrester, Andrew Sloop, Marianne Hansen, research advisors Ted Falk, Brian Teller, and Jonathan Ross. We have two other members who aren't here, Alan Abravanel and Peter Baer. In order to understand Ballot Measure 7, I think it's important to first review some of the basic elements of the adopted Ballot Measure number 5. And as shown on page 125 of your report, the tax rate, that is the rate as opposed to the absolute limit on actual taxes, is limited in 1992-93 to $12.50 for schools and $10 for non-schools. That reduces over time to $5 for schools and $10 for non-schools in the 95-96 year. During that time, any shortfall in educational dollars have to be made up out of the state general fund. What Ballot Measure 7 does is to change that rate limitation on non-owner occupied properties from the $5 limitation to 20. What you end up with then is a result creating a situation where homeowners have a rate limitation of $15 a thousand and non-homeowners $30 a thousand. And in addition, Ballot Measure 7 provides something that Ballot Measure 5 did not, and that is comparable relief to renters. And the language is essentially equivalent to that provided to homeowners. Now, our committee, both the majority and minority, agreed on essential facts. And one of the essential facts I think would be fair to say is that we would agree on the following statements with regard to the advertising which you've seen with regard to Ballot Measure 7, which have followed two basic themes. One, save our schools, and the other, it'll double your taxes. It's our opinion that both of those statements are at least misleading. First of all, Measure 7 will provide approximately 65% of replacement school revenues, as would be required by Measure 5. If you couple this with the fact that we have shrinking state revenues, it's pretty clear that by itself, Ballot Measure 7 will not save our schools. Secondly, Ballot Measure 7 doesn't necessarily and will not double your taxes. By the terms of the measure, non-owner occupied property will revert to pre-Measure 5 rates or the $20 limit, whichever is the lowest. And inasmuch as most property in the state is presently under the limit, that obviously means there is some room for additional taxes, which must be approved by voters. I might parenthetically note that this would and could lead to a situation where homeowners could vote to increase taxes on someone other than themselves, which is an unusual feature, perhaps, of this measure. As I've noted earlier, the committee, both the majority and minority, agreed on the essential facts as we heard them from the testimony and disagreed on the implications of what those facts meant. What we agreed on as a majority and a minority was that the Measure 5 limitations presently in place will devastate Oregon's educational and governmental systems. We also agreed that any measure, or that we should have tax reform, and that any tax reform measures or package should meet the requirements of adequacy, fairness, and diversity. Ballot Measure 7 by itself does not do this. First of all, as I previously indicated, it doesn't generate sufficient revenues to at least bring us back to the pre-Measure 5 levels. Secondly, it shifts the burden to property-intensive businesses. And third, it continues our reliance on property tax for education. It doesn't necessarily, however, and the committee would agree that it doesn't necessarily preclude a split roll tax from being a part of an ultimate tax reform package. And finally, we felt, although it may be significant, it's not enough in and of itself to support Ballot Measure 7, that it contains renter relief. As I've noted, it's the implication of these facts which are leading to the split, the difference between the majority and the minority. And I'd like to ask John Stride if he would present then the majority view.
Before I begin my remarks, I'd like to, on behalf of the Ballot Measure 7 Study Committee members, thank Alan Brickley for his leadership on the committee and commend him for a job well done. The basic question facing your committee and now you is whether the imperfections of Ballot Measure 7 make it a counterproductive source of revenue. Your committee concluded that while Measure 7 is not perfect, it does not place such an onerous burden on any segment of taxpayers so as to be rejected just out of hand. But Measure 7 by itself is not the comprehensive tax reform that Oregon needs. As Alan said, it is not adequate to meet the long-term needs, and it suffers from some unfairness in that it places an excessive burden on some property-intensive taxpayers. However, this point is mitigated by the fact that under Measure 7, there will be some rebalancing of tax equity between individual taxpayers that balance more. Finally, we recognize that Ballot Measure 7 would not create a diverse tax in that it once again is reliant upon property tax to fund local schools. We know that Oregon school districts have suffered from inequities as a result of property tax-based funding and the local school levy system. But the diversity may come from using Ballot Measure 7 as a building block of a comprehensive tax reform. The point at which the majority and the minority have parted company on this question is whether, as the minority asserts, the passage of Measure 7 may possibly undercut the drive to adopt a comprehensive tax reform, and given the deficiencies of the measure, that's a sufficient reason to vote no. Or, as the majority believes, that comprehensive tax reform may not come in time to rescue Oregonians from the irreparable harm that we may suffer as Measure 5 fully phases in. And therefore, notwithstanding the imperfections in Measure 7, we would urge that some revenue is better than no revenue. Of course, the immediate question then is whether the passage of Measure 7 will delay the kind of comprehensive tax reform that Oregon needs. The answer to this question depends on one's view of the confidence in the Oregon legislature and the Oregon voters to tackle the hard question of comprehensive tax reform. Admittedly, the majority's position is somewhat skeptical, but our skepticism has some historical justification. Those of you who have lived in Oregon for 20 or more years, as I have witnessed time and time again attempts to limit property taxes by initiatives imposing property tax limits. In each case, the effects of the passage of such a measure would have devastating effects on K through 12 education, on state services, and higher education. With each successive attempt to limit property taxes, the margin of defeat grew narrower and narrower. And with each time, Oregonians and the Oregon legislature took one step closer to the abyss of devastation of economic and educational systems. And each time, the legislature and the Oregon voters failed to act to solve the problem. We now see Measure 5, and it may wreak the kind of havoc that each of the property tax limitation measures before it would have done. But Measure 5 is a phase-in. So instead of throwing Oregon directly into the abyss of devastation, it simply places us on the edge looking down. We are now so perilously close to what occurs if we go over that edge that we can see the kind of devastation that, but for some immediate action, may occur. We see prisons closing, we see 45 children in each classroom, and we see deteriorating infrastructure. In short, we see something that looks remarkably like California. The minority believes that forcing the legislature to stand on the edge of that abyss will give it the political will to develop a fair and balanced tax reform. The majority, however, fears that the legislature will stand frozen in inaction and just stare. Some will choose not to act because they simply aren't convinced that a fiscal crisis will exist because of ballot measure 7. Some because they lack the political will to make tough decisions. Some because they will not accept some particular element of comprehensive tax reform unless their favorite element is included. And some because the vote may not occur on the correct day. Perhaps the majority is unduly harsh on the legislature. Good men and women of the legislature will surely seize the opportunity to construct a tax package that will lead Oregon into the 21st century. But even if they succeed, will voters adopt such a tax package? The ever-changing demographics in Oregon and what seems to be a change in a sense of social responsibility that Oregonians have for future generations to provide for them the same kinds of services that were provided for them, make the prospects of passage of such a tax package questionable. With this view of Oregon's future, the majority believes that some revenue is better than no revenue. The minority's position that the passage of Measure 7 may sap the political will of the legislature to create comprehensive tax reform actually exposes the majority's own skeptical, even perhaps cynical view of the legislature. If indeed the legislature is up to the task of developing a comprehensive tax reform that the minority calls for, then it will not use the passage of Measure 7 to hide from those hard decisions. The majority of the committee believes that Measure 7 provides a safety net, although temporary, in the event the legislature or Oregon voters fail to act that will keep Oregon from being damaged irreparably by the slash and burn effects of Measure 5. For these reasons, I move the City Club to adopt the majority report. Your study committee also had a minority report, and here to deliver that minority report is Chairman Alan Brickley.
Thank you. John has done a very nice job of identifying the deficiencies in ballot measure 7, which the minority would certainly agree with. And clearly, everybody agrees then that ballot measure 7 is a band-aid, short-term approach to the overall problem. And I might suggest, and the minority would suggest, that it may not even provide additional dollars to the educational system. The reason is that we have shrinking state revenues, which means that we're losing money on the side of prisons, human resources, and education, which the three of those are the major components of state spending. So if there are additional dollars injected into the overall tax system, maybe even the appropriate thing to do in order to try to keep all governmental services afloat would be to divert the state general fund requirements for funding education to those other two services. So I guess I would be concerned whether or not ballot measure 7 would provide any additional funds to the educational process. The second issue, and the one that was spent a lot of time discussing, and that is, what is the effect of ballot measure 7 if it's passed on potential tax reform, which everybody agrees is necessary? I guess I would only ask, or the rhetorical question, and that is, if the voters accept ballot measure 7 and save our schools, what kind of a response will there be on any other and subsequent tax reform measures? My guess is that it will be no. We have a system in place to rectify these problems. We've got a legislature, we've got an initiative referral system. I think it's inappropriate for us to try to outguess the system, and we need to let it work, and we will hopefully come out of that with the tax reform package that is really necessary. One thing that was not addressed is, what is the impact on business? And I would suggest there are two basic impacts on business. Number one, it's going to raise their taxes, at least in relative terms to others. And secondly, what kind of a perception will the business community, both inside and outside the state, have when a ballot measure of this nature is passed? One of the items that we discussed was, in fact, what does this do to the business community? And the report indicates that the committee felt that businesses were still coming to Oregon pre-Measure 5. They knew what the tax system was. They knew which the tax impact was, but they came anyway. Businesses still developed in Oregon. Therefore, although it may be an important factor, it's certainly not the primary factor, or it's one among many which were considered. Well, there was an article in the Oregonian, which obviously we didn't consider because it came out on October 7th, which was 2 days ago, and it noted that 96% of the state's private businesses employ fewer than 50 workers. In addition to that, it surveyed 44 cities, and it determined that of those 44 cities, with the sole exception of Detroit, Michigan, Portland, Oregon had the highest taxes on businesses. And of these, property taxes constituted the heaviest burden. So obviously, it would seem to follow that the increase in ballot measure 7 taxation will have a disparate impact on businesses. And finally, as to the perception issue, that's one that it's hard to determine without perhaps doing a poll of the business community inside and outside the state. And although I personally, and I suspect most of you would be suspect of anecdotal evidence, we've heard about that a lot, I still have to share with you an anecdote, a call that I received yesterday from a businessman who is a vice president in one of our major businesses here in the state, who said, you've talked about all these other things in terms of ballot measure 7, but let me tell you what it feels like. I said, well, what does it feel like? And he said, it feels like class warfare. And I would submit to you that if that's at all an indication of what the business community feels in terms of ballot measure 7, that we don't need that kind of a situation here in Oregon. For that reason, I would move for the substitution of the minority report for the majority report. Thank you.
Thanks, John and Alan. We'll now begin the debate on the motion to substitute the minority report for the majority report. Voting yes to substitute the minority report constitutes a no vote on the ballot measure. Please use the yes microphone, the one over here. If you want to support the substitution, please use the no microphone if you're opposed to the substitution. Again, I would ask you to limit your comments to no more than 1 minute, and I will first recognize someone who favors the substitution of the minority report.
Hello, my name's Eloise Carson. I do favor substitution of the minority report. Being a small business person here in Oregon, I feel that this ballot measure, the backers of this ballot measure, see an opportunity for the majority of people to vote the minority of people to pay more taxes. And small business owners, most of them don't own a lot of property, but they own enough that an extra tax burden does hurt. And I feel like the level of how much more taxes we pay relative to everybody else does hurt the small business people, and that is most of the business people in the state are small.
Thank you.
Richard Forrester, I was on the majority part of the committee. Ballot Measure 5 represented one of the major shifts in tax burden from businesses to homeowners. Ballot Measure 7 restores some of that shift back, but more importantly, it provides approximately $800 million in revenue for the state. That, in effect, is an insurance policy. It's an insurance policy that just in case the voters of Oregon are not ready to reshift the tax burden by approving a sales tax, just in case they're not ready to approve a sales tax, that insurance policy would enable the legislature to fill in the gaps without necessarily going to the voters by enacting other measures to produce additional revenues. It's an insurance policy against a potential disaster. Thank you.
Andy Sloop, member of the Measure 7 minority. I'd like to point out that the recent Supreme Court decision that tax increment financing is included under Measure 5's limitations would be carried over under Measure 7, and that could have a potentially damaging impact on many of our fine urban renewal programs here in the metro area.
Thank you.
My name is Tim Nesbitt. I'm a member of the club, and in response to the remarks of the chairperson of the committee, it is not true that schools are protected under Measure 5 from the cuts, even in the short term. What we see projected for the Portland School District next year is a 19% cut in its budget, in its total budget, as a result of the cuts to the state general fund, to basic school support. That kind of cut is intolerable. This is the only statewide, this is the only proposal on the ballot, and this is the only statewide election scheduled until the spring of 1994. This does present an opportunity to help save our schools from cuts of this magnitude. Although every dollar saved at the school level will be restored to the state general fund, follow the dollars. 63% of the state general fund goes to schools. And that is not a proportion which is likely to change downward in the future. This is a proposal to help save our schools in Portland.
Thank you.
I'm Gus Mattersdorf, a member of the club. I'm a bit embarrassed to be here because I really oppose ballot measure number 5, as of a couple of years ago, very much, very strongly. However, the redeeming feature of it was the one that was just mentioned, namely that it shifted some taxes from business to individuals. It seems to me that clarifies the tax structure. It's not true that business taxes are paid by somebody else and not by us. All business taxes are paid by businesses as tax collectors and collected from us in one form or another. Either we are stockholders and we get fewer dividends because businesses have less profits to pay out, or we are employees of the firm and get lower wages because businesses have less to pay out, or we are suppliers who get our supplies, who get paid less for our supplies, or we are, let's see, what's the other one? We're the customers. Yes, we pay higher prices. We pay higher prices because businesses have to jack up the prices. We pay. The only difference is that none of us know how much we pay, and it remains uncertain.
Thank you.
I'm opposed to that.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. When Measure 5 was being considered, one of the pitches that was made to the voters was that poor elderly residents were being taxed out of their homes, and that was a very moving kind of argument. And I think it moved a lot of voters, as evidenced by the fact that Measure 5 passed. What happened with Measure 5 was that a very substantial share of the tax relief in Measure 5 went to business instead of residents, homeowners, and some of the business owners didn't even live in Oregon. They got tax relief. Measure 7 would essentially correct that, and I think it's important.
Thank you.
I'm Jim Nelson, member, and I've also knocked over the mic. One segment of our Oregon citizenry apparently hasn't been here to speak against Ballot Measure 7. I hope I'm speaking for a substantial number. I am a real estate investor in Oregon in modest real estate. My tenants are small people, mom and pop grocery, a beauty parlor, a record store. Oftentimes, I've hardly started and you have me, that was the mic that knocked over, not me. They do not have the kind of money that allows them to take the brunt of the tax increase. And I will take the brunt of that tax increase without any question. They are up to their hilt in a recessionary period without funds. I think this is an unfair tax. I think it's divisive. And I think it's the opponents reaching into the pocket of somebody else because they didn't want to increase the rate in Ballot Measure 5 and make it fair across the board. I beg of you, do not support this unfair bill.
Thank you.
William Lewis, City Club member. Excellent teachers are very difficult to find. Excellent teachers are even more difficult to keep. If we have a 2 to 4 year gap in school funding that even approaches what appears to be the case in the materials that I've read, many of the top teachers we have in our system that we need so badly will leave. If we do get the funding back, and I say if, I'm not sure that those teachers will come back. We can't afford to lose those people. Thank you.
Stephen O'Donnell, a City Club member. We started out this discussion, I thought, very nicely when the man brought out framework on which to decide whether we tax or don't tax. And one of those things was equity and fairness. All this has been lost in this discussion. We're now down to the situation of saying that the voters, which are the people, have created a problem and said they're not going to provide funding in a certain manner. We're responding, and that's our cynical argument, which is the same as, I think, the worst possible reason you can use to argue for something. You're saying, well, this is a weak spot. We can take the electorate and put a tax on business, don't talk about whether it's fair, just, justified, or anything else, and nail them. This is what upset people to start with Measure 5, and this is what we're going to see again. I say vote against it because it doesn't meet the standards of a good tax.
Call for the question.
We have a call for the question. Is there a second? Okay. To cut off debate requires a 2/3 majority vote. So all those in favor of cutting off debate and calling for the question, please raise your cards. All those opposed? Okay, we will end debate there. The motion before the membership is whether to substitute the minority report for the majority report. A vote for the motion means you favor a no vote on the ballot measure. All those in favor of the motion to substitute, please raise your card. And we may need a count on this. Okay. All those opposed? Do we need a count? Okay. Let's do it one more time and we'll catch the count. All those in favor of the substitution, please raise your cards and keep them up high. It does look very close. Do we have those? I think we're getting the tabulation. Can we let them put their hand down yet? Okay. All those opposed? Okay, I think you can put your hand down. We're still tabulating. I think it's been a while since we've had a vote quite this close. I think we have our results here momentarily. It was very close. The substitution motion fails. 63 for the substitution, 73 against. The motion having failed, we now return to the main motion to adopt the majority report, which recommends a yes vote on the ballot measure 7. Is there any further debate? All right, all those in favor? All those against? Let's have those in favor one more time. All those against? Motion carries. Thank you very much for your patience. I will tell you that we will continue the time until 1:30 to allow adequate to vote for Measure 9, and we'll now turn our attention to the report on Ballot Measure 9. This measure would require that all governments in Oregon discourage homosexuality, other listed behaviors, and not facilitate or recognize them. And I'd like to turn the podium over to Alan Oliver, manager of the Leather Furniture Company and chair of this committee. Alan?
Thanks, Patty. I know at this point in the procedure that people get restless and ready to go, but I ask your patience because this is an important measure that we need to give attention to. I would also like to thank my committee, which is seated at this table over here. Doug Green, Jenny Pietka, Dr. Susan Schoening, Corleen Kraft, Don Sterling, Floreed Walker, John Murphy, our research advisor, Michelle McKenna, and Dr. William Connor is not here today, and we also had Eric Wangan on our committee. These people, in our 2 months of study, showed an incredible capacity for in-depth investigation, intellectual curiosity, just general good thinking, fairness, and compassion. And I think those were all qualities that were needed for our investigation. It was a real privilege to work with them, and I count them as friends. I will also resist, I guess, the temptation to suggest that the reason our report didn't have a minority committee is that we only had one lawyer on the committee. You can draw your own conclusions. This ballot measure 9 is probably the most notorious of those to be voted on this next month. It's not one of those obscure measures that sneaks up on voters. It's charged with moral, political, and constitutional issues, and I doubt that there will be too many Oregonians leaving their voting booths saying, "Now, what was that thing on homosexuality?" If any measure has been examined under the spotlight of public attention, it is this one. And yet, as I think back to when we started our study process 2 months ago, I remember that there were still a lot of the aspects of the measure that needed to be clarified and explained. At the start of the study, for example, I remember my own shock at realizing that this measure was going to affect all levels of government in Oregon and not just the state government. And I mention my own ignorance on this point just to tell you that none of us got into this study because we were experts or because we had any particular axe to grind. We may not have been necessarily bias-free, but we did make it our task to learn everything we could about this measure, talking to people on both sides of the question, researching the arguments in favor and against, and trying to draw out the ramifications for the state if it were to pass. The phrases of this measure: homosexuality, pedophilia, sadism, and masochism; promote, encourage, facilitate; abnormal, wrong, unnatural, and perverse, became so familiar to us that most of us could recite them in our sleep. And as this happened, we became convinced that the passage of this measure would be a public policy nightmare for Oregon. Let me for a few minutes point out the most important sections of our report. Probably the key paragraph, which represents our findings, is on page 144 of the bulletin, where it reads, "The fundamental objection to Measure 9 is not specifically that it is aimed against homosexuals, but that it calls for official repression of a target group of the population. The measure would violate the principle that one of the purposes of the government is to protect unpopular individuals from oppression by a majority. It would set a dangerous precedent for attacking the rights of other groups identified by such characteristics as race, religion, or national origin," end quote. While the Oregon Citizens Alliance claims to hold up standards of family life and community decency, their proposed amendment cuts to the very core of the values of our society. Each subsection of Measure 9 threatens its own set of harmful impacts. Section 41(1) would eliminate any protections in law based on sexual orientation or similar terms. This means that the state and local provisions prohibiting intimidation or harassment, discrimination in housing or employment would all be canceled. Surely an unacceptable step backward in civil rights protections. Section 41(2) would direct governments not to promote, encourage, or facilitate homosexuality. Gay men and lesbians and their supporters would not be allowed to use public streets for celebrations or parades, or use schools or other facilities for such activities as sensitivity training. This would undoubtedly conflict with federal constitutional protections of free speech and freedom of assembly. The implications of this section, however, go much further and in unpredictable directions. Public libraries might be directed to remove books about homosexuality from their shelves. Agencies that receive public money to support the visual and performing arts, and state agencies like Oregon Public Broadcasting might be subject to censorship. Private individuals and organizations requiring licenses might be affected, and nonprofit and charitable organizations might be subject to loss of support and exemptions. The OCA insists that the measure would be applied in a moderate fashion, but it opens the door for the most extreme actions. Section 41(3) would require governments and schools to set a standard that homosexuality is wrong and to be discouraged.